Well, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you all here to the Korea Economic Institute. I'm Troy Sangarone. I'm the Senior Director for Congressional Affairs and Trade here at KEI. I think today we'll have a very interesting discussion. One of the things that I think many people have wondered, is how, in essence, North Korea has been able to withstand much of the pressure on the economic side with the UN sanctions that have gone in place. And I think, one of the things that Bruce, through his book, which, by the way, is on sale outside and is 50% off today, so you're going to get a great deal if you decide to buy a copy, does a good job of sort of documenting and walking through is, what North Korea's revenue streams and their transactions with the Middle East and Africa look like. And this is an important component, one that we haven't really looked at very much. And so I think, what Bruce has to say today will be very enlightening. With that, I'm going to take, everyone has their bios here, but I'm just going to briefly introduce them. Next to me, we have Bruce Bechtold, who's a professor of political science at Angelo State. I always want to say San Angelo for some reason. I don't know why. But Angelo, yeah. But he's at Angelo State University and is the author of the North Korean military proliferation in the Middle East and Africa. And we have as a discussant today David Maxwell, who is currently a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy and is also a 30-year veteran of the United States Army, who, as we all know, has extensive experience dealing with North and South Korea. And with that, Bruce, I will turn it over to you.
Oh, you mean the ONOFF button? Okay. How y'all doing? Everybody hear me? Okay. Well, I'm going to run through what the thesis of my book is, my new book, and I'm going to briefly tell you why I wrote it, and then I'll get into some specifics, and I'll try to keep it to about no more than 20, 25 minutes. Those of you who know me, like Mark and Kyle and these two criminals, know that I am a long...
Please don't include us in your criminal activities.
Okay.
No affiliation with Department 39.
But you guys know that I can be long-winded, so when I get to it, but I can see the clock there, so that at least will be helpful. Around 2013, after I'd been reading a lot of stuff in open channels, talking to my good friends like Larry Nish about things like this for years, I'm watching C-SPAN, because I am a nerd king, and I was watching congressional testimony from a four-star general in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee. And John McCain asked this gentleman, it was about the Syrian civil war. So who is Syria getting all of these chemical weapons from? And the general answered, from Russia and elsewhere. And my reaction was, what? And let me explain why. In 2009, how many people here know a gentleman named Chuck Downs? How many people here have never heard of Chuck Downs? How many people here have seen Three Faces of Eve? Joanne Woodward, 1958 Academy Award-winning performance, but I digress. Anyway, so in 2009, Chuck Downs, who at the time was the director of HRNK, which many of you know of and have worked with, one of his board members asked him to find someone who would be willing to write a journal article on North Korean proliferation, because there was a big concern about it in Israel, but nobody else was talking about it. So I sat down and started writing things in 2009, and I found all kinds of interesting things. For example, in 2009, which, as you guys know, was 9 years ago, there was already evidence that North Korea had proliferated chemical weapons too, and was training them with chemical weapons, the Syrians, and that they had sold Scuds to Egypt. That's just a couple of things. 2009, there was also a great deal of evidence about the Syrian nuclear weapons program and basically how North Korea had built an exact duplicate of Yongbyon in the eastern Syrian desert, which some of you also know about in detail. So this is nothing new. So by 2013, when I'm watching this on the news, or on C-SPAN, which is sort of just a recording of everything that happens, I said to myself, you got to start writing about this seriously. You got to start doing in-depth research, because nobody else will. which also then popped in my head, well, if nobody else is doing research on this, who's to know if I'm right or wrong, right? So, and that accounts for the about 70 pages of endnotes in the book. Because when you read this book, for most of you, and you will read the book, there's 10 copies for sale, half price. When you read the book, you're going to see things that you simply haven't seen before. About the volume of proliferation, about the types of weapons, and especially when it comes to Africa, about who these weapons and training are going to. So if you're going to do something like that as a scholar, you need to really have your ducks in line. You really need to have a lot of sources, and I do. So let me talk about how I approach this. First of all, and again, this is an approach nobody has used before. No one has written a book on proliferation by North Korea before, available for 50% off. First of all, I describe the military capabilities that North Korea has, because you can't really understand whether you're a military expert or a diplomat or someone who compiles stuff for Congress, as Larry did, or a human rights expert like Dave is. No matter what you are, you can't understand proliferation from one nation to another unless you understand what's being proliferated. Why? Because you can't understand what they're going to do with that stuff unless you understand the stuff, right? So that's the first part of my book after the introduction. The second part of my book is actually the largest single chapter, and that chapter is entitled, I can't remember. I believe it's entitled, How Do They Do It? Let me look. How Do They Do It? Yeah. And it addresses all of the ways that North Korea has changed its tactics, techniques, and procedures, or TTP, over the years, and often changes them in matters of months, doing things like reflagging of ships over and over again. I'll talk about this in detail in a couple of minutes. Putting phony cargo in along with the real proliferated cargo. And also this chapter goes in depth about the illicit financial system. I think most people, because this is essentially when you talk to KEI, you're talking to largely Korean specialists, right? And that's what I'm talking to today. So most of you remember the Banco Delta Asia debacle, right? It's very important to understand the difference between the way North Korea's financial system was then and the way it is now. Essentially what happened with Banco Delta Asia is we even surprised ourselves. A lot of you in this room know and admire Bill Newcomb, as I do, and know David Asher as well. Those two guys outdid themselves in 2005. Their interagency task force, they literally had the North Koreans on the ropes. And it all started with that $25 million that was frozen in Banco Delta Asia based on actions taken as part of the Patriot Act, Section 311, okay? Which says essentially, if you're doing business with North Korea, you're not doing business with American dollars at all. And we've done that to two banks since then. What happened then was it created a snowball effect. So that about 11 months after that had happened, the North Koreans were literally taking huge suitcases full of cash to Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, because they couldn't get anybody else to take their money. What happened as a result of that? Well, for one thing, our foreign policy failed completely. Chris Hill made perhaps the worst deal ever, and that resulted in exactly nothing for us except for taking North Korea off the terrorism list of nations who support terrorism. Something I was always against since, well, North Korea is a nation that supports terrorism. But that's just me. The result of that for the North Koreans was they learned their lesson. And the three words that apply to the lesson that they learned was diversify, diversify, diversify. The network that they have now is way, way, way more nuanced, sophisticated, diversified, and way, way harder to contain or attempt to shut down than their illicit financial network was in 2005. That's just a fact. So any action that we take against that financial network has to be much more resourced, much more nuanced, and we're going to be playing, and are playing, much more of a game of whack-a-mole. So something for everybody to think about. I hope you'll ask me questions about that. That's chapter 3. So what do you think? You want me to talk about Syria and Iran and Africa for a bit? Everybody want me to do that? Okay, why not? Let's talk about Syria first. The relationship between Syria and North Korea when it comes to proliferation. And when I say proliferation, I don't just mean weapons, I mean capabilities. I'm sweating, by the way. I'm a short, fat Jewish guy, and I sweat a lot, so sorry. I'm not nervous. But if you talk about the Syrian relationship, weapons, training, assistance with fabrication facilities, etc., repairing of systems, all of this started in 1967. And essentially, this was going on all over the world in the late 60s, all the way up till the end of the Cold War, at the end of the 1980s, up till 1990. It wasn't just North Korea that was doing this, it was Cuba as well. Everybody knows about Cuba's antics in places like Grenada and Angola, etc. So that's where their relationship with Syria started in 1967. They had pilots flying sorties against my cousins in Israel in 1967 and 1973, and in the Bekaa Valley War, if you want to call it a war, in 1981 and 82. By the way, they didn't ever shoot down an Israeli jet. Just thought I'd pass that on. So they had things like that. They had MRLs, MRL batteries that were actually run by North Koreans. This is I hurt my back. This is in the book, and you can look at my sourcing for it if you like. I hope you will. They actually had MRL batteries that were targeting the Israeli army that were helping out the Syrians. 122 millimeter MRL batteries in the 81-82 war, and in the Yom Kippur War as well in 73. So very interesting stuff. That never stopped. What did stop was the Cold War. We all got that, right? So the paradigm of how North Korea proliferated stuff and capabilities and advice to the Syrians changed overnight. The connections were there, but it went from being a gratis relationship where essentially the Soviets, the Russians, gave the Syrians everything, or they gave it to the Syrians through the North Koreans, to it being a cash and carry business. After 1990, everything the Syrians did, up till now, with the North Koreans, was a cash and carry business. So, when did that really kick off in a serious way? Well, right after the Gulf War. Does everybody remember what the Saudis did right after the Gulf War? They gave a lot of money to a lot of people. In fact, they actually offered money to the United States. Of course, we told them no. We're not soldiers of fortune. But several nations did accept their money. One of them being Syria. That is to say, in the amount of billions of dollars. No one's clear exactly on how much that was. Most people say about $3 billion. What do they do with that money? Well, they bought 150 Scud Cs. Who here knows what a Scud C is? You know what the difference between a Scud C and a Scud B is, by the way? A Scud C is longer. You know what the difference between a Scud D and a Scud C is? It's still longer. And do you know why they call the Scud ER the Scud ER? Because it's got extended range. Pretty complicated. Anyway, they bought about 150 Scud Cs from the North Koreans in the early 90s. Immediately following that, very soon thereafter, the North Koreans worked out a deal with them to assist them with chemical weapons. Is everybody hearing this? That was in the early 1990s. In the 1990s, the North Koreans built a chemical weapons fabrication facility for the Syrians, their first one. There's several now. They continue to use chemical weapons fabrication facilities where the North Koreans send over the precursors, the platforms that will carry those chemical weapons, which for the North Koreans are primarily multiple rocket launcher rockets, like 122s, which, by the way, is the same type of MRL used to, too loud?
Your mouth's too close.
Stop it. The same type of MRL used to attack Yeonpyeong-do in 2010. That's a 122. And Scuds, of course. And from that time forward, the Scud capability mixed with the chemical capability, mixed with the artillery capability, the North Koreans sent guys over that would wear full Soviet-style mop gear, and they would conduct exercises annually with the Syrians in mop gear with live chemical weapons, which is something I would never, ever, ever want to do. Can you imagine us? Hey, we're going to go have an exercise with VX. I don't think so. But that's what they did every year with the Syrians. They also began to do this with the Iranians using Scud missiles, and a bunch of them were killed a few years ago when a missile exploded on the pad and a bunch of chemical weapons spilled out and killed a bunch of guys. Iranians, Syrians, North Koreans. So why do I tell you all this background? Because in 2011, 12, and 13, when guys like Larry first started writing about the Syrian army using chemical weapons against its own people, this was simply something they had already trained for, were already equipped for, and that they simply stepped it up for when they were actually fighting in combat. They were ready when that war happened to do that. So that's something and that's in the book. I lay it out for everybody who reads the book and buys it. When you read the book, there's a whole chapter on Syria. But that's only part of the picture. As you use missiles and as you fire weapons and as your tanks get destroyed, you need new ones, right? So this civil war has been a boon for the North Koreans, the military-industrial complex, such as it is. North Korea has sold a great deal of spare Scud parts, for lack of a better term, Scud missiles, chemical weapons precursors, all kinds of stuff to the North Koreans. Every kind of small, to the Syrians, I should say, every kind of small arms you can imagine, refurbishing tanks, refurbishing APCs. But this has also taken on a life of its own when it comes to the guys helping out the Syrians. That is to say, Hezbollah and Iran. They're all buying those conventional weapons from the North Koreans. Sometimes they go directly to Iran and then to Syria or Hezbollah, sometimes directly to Syria, but paid for by Iran mostly. Sometimes directly to Hezbollah. It just depends. There's a lot of shipments. As you know, if you follow the UN Panel of Experts reports, the latest report that we've seen, the public, because there's a new one that should be out, but it's not out yet. I've seen pieces of it. That report in March, that was released officially in March of this year, said there were 41 shipments between 2012 and 2017. That's a lot. So something to think about. I'll move on to Iran. But before I do, let me add some context to Iran and Syria, how they're tied in together. Who here knows about the plutonium reactor that was destroyed in 2007? Okay. If you haven't read it already, last night, the audience I had at the Institute for World Politics, everybody except for Don, had not read the Director of National Intelligence report that in detail described how the North Koreans helped Syria build that reactor, put a fake roof over it, because apparently they felt the Israelis were stupid. Oh, there's a fake roof over the plutonium reactor. It must not be there anymore. Right. That piece describes everything, including some names of North Koreans who actually were there that they were able to identify. That was destroyed in 2007. In 2008 is when the report came out. A few months after that, the former deputy minister of defense for Iran, who had just defected to Europe, told his handlers that that plutonium reactor had been paid for by the Iranians to the tune of about $2 billion. What does that mean to me? That tells me that if what he said was true, and it appears that there's no reason to disbelieve him, that Iran had at that time a two-track nuclear program, just like the North Koreans. They had an HEU program, and they were going offshore into Syria for the plutonium program, which they paid the North Koreans to build for the Syrians. So interesting stuff. That is my segue into Iran. Iran is North Korea's best customer, hands down. Tanks, trucks, submarines, ships, every single small arms, ballistic missiles of every single kind, nearly, that North Korea makes, liquid fuel missiles, that is, and as I will discuss in a minute, probably the nuclear program. So let's talk about that in a bit of detail. I don't want to bore everybody. To do that, you just have to read my book. So nobody's laughing. I would expect at least a courtesy laugh, you know what I mean? But the Scud-B, and I love this story, so you guys will love this story too. I'm going to tell it in a way you'll really dig. So who knows what happened in 1979?
November 4th?
I don't know. Camp David happened in 1979.
U.S. Embassy.
Oh, yeah. Well, that happened that year, too. Very important event, obviously. In 1979, yeah, that too. 19... Yeah, that also happened in 79. Stop it, you guys. A lot of important things happened in 1979. By the way, read John Wickham's, General Wickham's book on that, the 12/12 incident. That is a good read. That is good. If you want to see a guy who was confused about what was going on, that was John Wickham when Park Chung-hee was assassinated. But I digress. 1979 was Camp David. Israel and Egypt normalized relations, and the United States started supplying arms to Egypt. What did that mean? Well, it meant Egypt had a bunch of Scuds they needed to do something with, right? So what do you do with them? You sell some of them to North Korea. North Korea had been trying to get Scuds, that is to say, any kind of ballistic missile from both the Chinese and the Russians for years and couldn't do it. But they got them from the Egyptians. What did they do? By 1981, the North Koreans actually had an assembly line going in North Korea that was making Scud-Bs. North Koreans are pretty smart. They're really just the ignorant, poorly fed brothers of the people that are in South Korea, and everybody knows South Koreans are pretty smart, which is why my daughter's so smart. She's half Korean. The other half, of course, is me, so, you know. So I think that's pretty incredible. 2 years, and they had the assembly lines going, which they immediately started selling to Iran. Guess who their next customer was? Anyone? Bueller? What is Egypt, Alex? So think about that. Egypt sells Scuds to North Korea so they can start producing them, so they can start selling them Scuds back. That is still going on today. The last shipment that was interdicted going into Egypt from North Korea of Scud parts was in 2016. It's still going on, though. Eventually, the North Koreans actually built a fabrication facility in Egypt so that all they had to do was put them together, of course, with North Korean assistance and spare parts. So anyway, Iran, Scud-B, Scud-C, Scud-D, Scud-ER, Muson, Nodong, Tapodong parts. 3 key rocket systems were tested last year in Iran. So let's talk about them. Let's talk about a missile they tested in January of 2017. Almost an exact duplicate of a Musadon. Everybody here knows what a Musadon is, right? It's the North Korean version of an SSN-6, but it's converted for land use. They sold 16 of those to the Iranians in 2005, and it continued to help the Iranians tweak their Musadon systems, which they call the Karamshar, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. I'm used to pronouncing Korean names, not Karamshar. You know, give me a Korean name. Kang, Pak, Lee, Kang. Anyway, That was the beginning of the year 2017. They also tested a Saphir rocket. One stage of the Saphir rocket is a no-dong. And they tested what's known as the Simorgh space-launched vehicle ballistic missile. When they tested the Simorgh, everybody figured out that the Simorgh had, coincidentally, one stage that was exactly the same as the Unha rocket that the North Koreans had tested. Everybody knows what the Unha is, right? We also call it the Taepodong, which was a cluster of 4 no-dong engines. And two guys who wrote an article about this for 38 North actually said, well, the distance between the no-dong engines on the Iranian version is 3 centimeters than the distance between the no-dong engines in the Korean version, North Korean version. So the North Koreans probably didn't help them build it. Right. So that's just last year. That's just last year, looking at North Korean collaboration with the Iranians. And when I say collaboration, let me make very clear to you what I mean by that. North Korea is the seller and Iran is the buyer. Iran is not helping North Korea with its ballistic missile program. Iran is paying cash and oil and other commodities to North Korea so they will build stuff for them. And one of the sanctions was 2016. Who here has heard of Bill Gertz? All you lefties in the crowd, you guys hate Bill Gertz, right? But those of us who were actually in intelligence, as I was, if you consider being at an intelligence agency, being an intelligence, or even making you intelligent for that matter. When I was at DIA in the Pentagon, we used to call him the angel of death. Because I can't tell you how many times we would give a brief, and then the next day it would be in the Washington Times. And we're all, how in the world did that happen? Well, Bill Gertz in 2013 wrote for the first time, that North Korea was collaborating with Iran, building them an 80-ton rocket booster. That was 2013. No comment from the government. In 2014 and 2015, Bill Gertz wrote articles, this time for the Washington Free Beacon, saying, as the JCPOA talks are going on, these ballistic missile parts are going back and forth between the two countries. As the talks are going on, and the U.S. government intelligence community knows about it, as does the president, and nothing's being done. Again, the government said nothing. 2015, the JCPOA talks were finished, right? And Obama got those through with a vast majority of about, 42% of Congress, something like that? You can laugh now. After the JCPOA talks actually went through, in January of 2016, the United States State Department sanctioned both Iran and North Korea and had specific names and corporations and front companies for an 80-ton rocket booster that had been going back and forth. So what Bill Gertz said was absolutely true and was proven true in 2016. And by the way, every quote on that and when it started is all in this book, available for 50% off. Ow. Okay, so that's just part of Iran. We talked about the missiles. We talked about conventional arms. Iran is buying all the conventional arms. Syria is. Who knows why? Because Iran has fighters that are fighting in that war too, right? They need those same types of arms. But let's talk about Iran's nuclear program, because there's been a lot of debate about that. Was there assistance from North Korea? Was there not assistance? Let me talk about what I say in the book. And it's in the latest article I published in Foreign Affairs. That would be Foreign Affairs. Who here has heard that song, On the Cover of the Rolling Stone? You guys heard that song? Well, for a professor, publishing in Foreign Affairs is kind of like being on the cover of Rolling Stone, you know what I mean? So I'm very proud of that. And nobody at my university cares. Oh yeah, Foreign Affairs, Bruce, whatever. You get me a Coke? Anyway, in 2003, in an article in the Los Angeles Times, veteran reporter Douglas France, you know him, Don, who later ended up working for your hero, John Kerry, in the State Department as well, reported, this is again 2003, Iranian contacts with China, Pakistan, Russia, and North Korea in pursuit of nuclear weapons capabilities. Of course, they were dealing with A.Q. Khan. But France also reported in this article that so many North Koreans are, 5 minutes, got it. Don't ever tell me what to do again. My mother told me what to do once. So many North Koreans are working on nuclear and missile projects in Iran that a resort on the Caspian coast is set aside for their exclusive use. That's a resort I want to hang out with, man, you know? A resort in Iran inhabited by North Koreans, I bet that's a rocking place. According to a January 2006 report by Robin Hughes in Jane's Defense Weekly, by the way, Larry's quoted some of this stuff too, North Korea constructed more than 10,000 meters of underground nuclear facilities for Iran. In 2011, reports in the European press suggested North Korea had supplied Iran with a computer program simulating neutron flows and training for how to use it. And in November of that year, the Washington Post, citing intelligence provided to the IAEA, stated Iran also relied on foreign experts to supply mathematical formulas and codes for theoretical design work for its nuclear program, some of which appear to have originated in North Korea. So we see a lot of anecdotal evidence. If your name is, I can't say his name. Should I say his name? I better not. There are a lot of people who say there's no evidence that North Korea has provided support for Iran's nuclear weaponization program. That's simply not true. The U.S. government has never, ever, ever, ever commented in any public forum of any kind whether or not North Korea is assisting Iran with its nuclear program. So we don't know for sure yet. I don't know for sure yet. I only deal in the unclassified world. I will tell you this. All of this anecdotal evidence I just read to you, which anybody could read in a newspaper or online, along with the defector from Iran, along with what dissident groups tells us, that leads me to the assessment of it is likely that North Korea has assisted Iran with its nuclear weaponization program. It is likely that where there's smoke, there is fire. And I'll just leave it there. One last thing. Africa. How many people here knew that North Korea was proliferating weapons and training all over Africa? How many people had no clue? How many just don't want to raise their hands? I'm a professor, I'm used to that. So let me talk briefly, and then I'll be done, Troy, about the countries in Africa and what in the past 5 years or so North Korea has proliferated to them. Democratic Republic of the Congo, small arms, construction of military facilities, training of presidential guard, training of special forces. I better go back to the beginning of this. I'm almost there, I promise. Egypt. I talked about the Scuds. They also have imported lots of small arms. Somebody asked me why later in Q&A. Namibia, an arms and ammunition factory, numerous military facilities, and military construction projects. According to the Royal Uniformed Services Institute, between 2000 and 2016, Namibia paid North Korea $311 million to do various military projects. Sudan, 122mm MRLs, AGP-250 ground attack systems, unspecified ground missile systems. Uganda, small arms of various types, training police forces, assembling and assisting with small arms factory, training Air Force pilots. That scares the hell out of me. North Korean pilots get 20 hours of flight a year, and now they're training the guys in Uganda how to fly? Okay. Angola, training of presidential guard elite units, sales of small arms, proliferation of naval aircraft, refurbishment of other systems. Eritrea, communications gear, surface-to-air missiles, rockets, explosives. Ethiopia, everything you can think of. 2 arms and ammunition factories, tanks, artillery, small arms, military training to elite units. They're one of North Korea's best customers in Africa and a United States ally. So there you go. Nobody's smiling. Zimbabwe, training of elite units by DPRK Soft, small arms. Mozambique, MANPADS, P-18 early warning systems, refurbishment of T-55 tanks, upgrading of anti-aircraft systems. Tanzania, refurbishment of MiG-21s, construction of military facilities, upgrading anti-air systems. And on and on and on. It's almost not who is North Korea selling to in sub-Saharan Africa, it's who are they not selling to. So this is very important. My good friend and mentor, Larry Nish, who's sitting here and bought one of my books, he stated and has restated in various fora that he estimates North Korea gets about $2 to $3 billion in profits from selling to the Iranians, including all the stuff they help pay for Syria and Hezbollah and the Houthis, who are now shooting extended range Scud Cs into Saudi Arabia. Golly, where do you think they got those? That makes sense to me. And anyone who looks at this and looks at the pure volume, which you'll see in this book, of what North Korea sells in the Middle East will not be surprised by that number. But what does surprise people is Africa. And they're not selling a whole lot of really expensive things to any of these countries, except for maybe Namibia, and possibly, we're now seeing new evidence, it'll be in the new UN panel of experts report, the Sudan, who wants more sophisticated weapons so they can kill more of their own people. Other than that, it's usually 6 million here a year, 10 million here, sometimes 25 or 30 million here, for example, Egypt. Little dribs and drabs, right? But when you add all of those countries up, that's hundreds of millions of dollars in arms sales a year. So I would ask that you keep in mind how important that is for Kim Jong-un keeping the elite happy and for contributing to development of new weapons programs and for putting money into his slush funds in places like Singapore, Vietnam, China, etc. And that's Africa. So I'm going to just shut down there because I don't want Troy Stangerone to slap me around, and I'll open up the floor for discussion and Q&A. All right.
Bruce, I'd be much more creative than that. Dave?
All right, just a few quick comments. First of all, Truth in Advertising, I reviewed the manuscript for this over a year ago, and for the last year, every time I'd send out an article on proliferation, I would say, someday Bruce's book's going to come out and answer all these questions. And I think his book answers so much, and he's covered a lot of ground in this, and it's true, the details are in there. Half the book is footnotes, okay? Sourcing, you look at this right here. Bruce is one of the most prolific footnoters I've ever met. So almost half the book is footnotes. So it is well referenced. I guess that is because you want to protect yourself from make sure nobody believes you're using classified information there. So, but it is so well documented. So researchers will really benefit from this. So he's covered a lot of ground, and questions I would ask him. Why don't we focus enough on that? He's alluded to this. Why have we not taken sufficient action to interdict, Proliferation Security Initiative and the like? But when you look at everything that he's described, he talked about today in his book, we talk a lot about the equipment. And so I just want to talk a little bit about, he just mentioned, it's not just equipment that's being sold. It's capabilities and training. Back in the 80s, when I was a young Special Forces team leader, I sent a couple NCOs to Saudi Arabia to train the Saudis' bodyguard battalion. And they wanted to build an obstacle course using American standards. And they took out the American manual, gave it to the Saudis, and they said, okay, we'll get it built. And the next thing you know, in comes a North Korean engineer battalion, a military engineer battalion. They built this American obstacle course in Saudi Arabia, so the U.S. Special Forces could train the Saudi forces. So, I saw this or heard this from my NCOs back in the 1980s. But what does this mean? Okay, so they're selling equipment, they're selling training, they're selling capabilities. In the United States, we have a concept called now the Security Force Assistance Brigade, and we send military out to train other militaries and and advise them and build partner capacity. And of course, that's good for training and developing experience. Well, North Korea, we think of the North Korean military, the NKPA, as obsolete weapons, poorly trained, haven't fought a war since the armistice in 1953. What kind of military can they have? Well, I would submit to you that it's not only the funds that are going back to the regime, but the NKPA is developing experience. They're testing. I mean, they're proliferating their doctrine. Their training. They're able to determine what works. What works in an insurgency environment in Africa. What works in conventional force on force. They're able to test, develop, test, train, and improve their own military based on how they are helping, Syria, Iran, countries throughout Africa and the like there. So this is something I think that is really overlooked because military analysts who look at North Korea, they just look at it in a vacuum. And of course, I think this is one of our biggest weaknesses. We think about North Korea just on the peninsula and not what it's doing around the world, and not only proliferation, but all the other illicit activities, Department 39 and the like. So this book really helps us to understand the breadth and depth of North Korea's global operations. That little country is operating, really around the world, and of course, North Africa, North Africa, the Middle East are prime areas for them to make money and to and really basically improve their military readiness. They're not directly fighting their conventional forces, but they are surely gaining experience, and they're able to take back that experience to incorporate that in training. So I think that is something I think we overlook in how how North Korea benefits from this type of proliferation. Just a couple other points. As Bruce said, if you read the beginning of the book, you really get an understanding of capabilities. And for a layperson like me, not an analyst like Bruce, he does break it down so that you can understand it, or at least I could understand it. And so I found that very, very useful. And so it's not. I mean, it is technical. But it's well written and not too technical for those of us who are not as proficient as him. A couple other things. We just saw interdiction in the Gulf. Something like 2,400 AKs going to the Houthis in Yemen, and of course the Houthis are an Iranian proxy. I haven't seen any reporting that it was from North Korea, but based on my knowledge of this book, and understanding what North Koreans are doing and the connections with Iran, and it seems possible, if not likely, that shipment, originated in North Korea, and so the other aspect of this, and the title is really important: enabling violence and instability. I mean, that's what North Korea is doing. It is enabling violence and instability in the Middle East and Africa, by the proliferation of weapons, the entire spectrum from small arms to missiles to possibly nuclear technology, and training and doctrine and capabilities there that really undermine, sovereign nations and regional stability, which of course is something that we would like to see. So North Korea, as we see, we heard the president today at the UN General Assembly talk about Kim Jong-un and his relationship. Two things we should keep in mind, and I'll stop here, is one, it is a bad actor proliferating, violence around the world. And of course, the other is that there are 25 million Koreans living in the north, a couple 100,000 of them in political prison camps, suffering every day. So as we see the euphoria of the summits and maybe another Trump-Kim summit, remember what North Korea is really doing, what they're up to. This book paints an important and somewhat disturbing and sad picture of their activities around the world. And I'll stop there. because I know Larry has a question.
Thank you, Dave. So I'd like to open to questions. Maybe we'll wait on Larry since Dave preempted that. We have a mic coming around, so we'll go with the gentleman right here first.
Okay. Well, Bruce, you mentioned that Chris Hill made a huge mistake. It went, when he pulled out of, when he gave out the BDA card, so to speak. And Mr. Maxwell, you also mentioned, you alluded to Mr. Trump's speech today. So I wonder whether or not you think we're on the cusp of another huge mistake. And I'd appreciate both your comments on whether there's lessons to be learned from BDA and other episodes, and what we're walking into or stepping into now. Thank you.
And
Well-
maybe before let's go ahead and just go and get the
Okay.
gentleman's question.
Milton Honig, International Center for Terrorism Studies. Just two things. First, I guess of course, Section T in the appendix, in Annex 1 of the JCPOA, refers specifically to banning the use by Iran of computer codes that sort of simulate the use of nuclear weapons. That's interesting. Of course, no mention of North Korea is made there, but that takes us back to the possible military dimensions related speech that Netanyahu gave on April 30th, talking about the case of weapon documents that Mossad had lifted from Iran, all relating to the possible military dimensions and nuclear program activities that Iran was carrying on, which actually report dates back to 2011 report by the IAEA. But still, the question I have is, you would expect that these documents themselves would contain some information, possibly about the source of some of the information that is contained in them. And do you know anything about that? I mean, that's one of the first things I would look for.
The question that you're asking is a really good question, and it's the same question I was asking. It's the first thing I thought, as a matter of fact, when it came out, how many of those documents there were. And the Mossad was able to steal them from Iran, obviously. And it's still interesting to me. Dave and I were talking about this the last time where did we see each other? Oh, Vermont. Vermont's a horrible place. But we were talking about this in Vermont. We had a conference up there. They've got all this stuff. They really haven't released much. My guess is some of what they haven't released yet is because we asked them not to. The Israeli government has what they need. There is no need for us to publicize it. And the only reason I say that is because in 2013, there's not a doubt in my mind that in 2013, the United States government knew exactly where those chemical weapons were coming from. And instead of saying in senatorial testimony, they're coming from North Korea, which, by the way, is where they were coming from, the guy says Russia and elsewhere. Okay, what possible reason do we have to not mention the name North Korea? I don't know, but it wasn't mentioned. And I hope those reports, when they come out, go into all of that. And if there's hard evidence that North Korea was supporting a nuclear program, that should tell us that.
Well, just one point. Netanyahu said in his talk on May 30th or whatever it was, that these documents contain things that we never knew before we signed the JCPOA. And yet, if you look at what he said was learned, he revealed nothing new that wasn't in the November 2011 IAEA report on PMDs. So you may be right. He might have said there are things in there that are totally new that would have changed the JCPOA, but for reasons you imply that the U.S. told them not to reveal these things.
I don't know
maybe
that.
That's the explanation
Yeah.
of a ridiculous statement that Netanyahu made.
Yeah, I don't know that, but it's possible. And, we'll just have to see when they release those documents, because I think it's going to come out eventually.
To Don's question on 2007 Chris Hill mistake, and are we on the verge of a big mistake?
Oh, yeah, Don, Don, you know Dave Asher and you know Bill Newcomb, right? You know these guys. You know how smart they are. We had North Korea by the short and curlies. They were going nowhere. They were done. They were, as I said, they were having to take huge suitcases to Ulaanbaatar banks just to launder their dirty money. And don't get me wrong, that is 40% of their real economy, all the illicit activities. So they had them. And what did we do? Our government said, well, great, we got them. Let's talk now and give up a bunch of concessions and stop the pressure. And so all I would say is, and I say this in the book, President Trump should learn his lessons from what happened with Chris Hill back in 2007 and 2008. There's a lesson to be learned there. And when these talks started going on, I was on a talk show on Sirius XM radio, and they had just had Chris Hill on right before me. And the talk show host asked me, you know, should Chris Hill be advising the current administration about talks with the North Koreans? I said, sure, he should. He should be telling them, don't do it the way I did it. So let's hope that the guys that are running things now learn that lesson, because that's an important lesson.
Just to comment on that quickly, we've got President Trump, President Moon, and Kim practicing what I like to call unconventional, experimental, top-down diplomacy. Everything is built on their personal relationships, and it is unconventional. It's not the norm. Then we have the professional diplomats and national security practitioners, who are trying to make a silk purse out of a pig's ear, maybe. I don't know if we're making the same mistake again, but given the history of North Korea, they're masterful at playing all sides against each other and getting something for nothing. So there's the old Lucy and Charlie Brown of the football. And I heard somebody say the other day, we don't want to buy the same horse twice. And somebody said that we're not buying the same horse twice. Now we're buying a dead horse, and which I thought was pretty true. But are we making a big mistake? I don't know. I mean, we are seeing something that we've never seen before. President Trump is practicing diplomacy like we've never seen it, and it just may work. It may, and it's going to be the national security community is going to have to figure out how to make it work. He may present some opportunities, but then again, it could very well result in North Korea achieving another victory. Which of course is, I think, simply their continued survival. So it's hard to say.
Yes.
Do you get into the proliferation of tunneling expertise and tunneling contracting?
I'm so happy you asked me that. I do. I address both the tunneling assistance in 2006 to Hezbollah and the tunneling assistance to Hamas that we saw. Did you see the pictures of the tunnels that Hamas had? If you know anything about North Korean underground tunnel building operations, the first thing you would think is North Korea when you looked at those tunnels. Concrete, reinforced. It looked like something that was, and you know that the soil in where Hezbollah built their tunnels was very different than the soil where Hamas built theirs. Think of Pensacola, Vice Virginia. Have you been to Pensacola before? That's the redneck Riviera, baby. Love that place. But if you go to Pensacola, you could live 10 miles from the beach, and your lawn will still have real sandy soil, right? That's how the soil is where Hamas built their tunnels, as opposed to Hezbollah, which built a lot of their tunnels literally through rock. And obviously the North Koreans helped them with that. So yes, several pages on that with lots of sources.
All right, Mark.
Mr. Tokola, you look a lot like one of my graduate students.
Don't insult him like that.
All right.
No need to.
His son's one of my graduate students.
Yep. Does North Korea get anything other than cash for when they sell weapons to other countries? they get help evading sanctions or money laundering or diplomatic support? Is there more that goes on?
Yes.
Okay, and then second, why does Egypt buy small arms from North Korea?
Aha, thank you for asking that question. I was at the Korea Society, again, I'm name dropping. I was at the world famous Korea Society last week in New York City. And I hear if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. And you know Steve Norper, right? A lot of you folks here know Steve. Good guy, great guy. Fun guy to drink beer with, by the way, which we did afterwards. And Steve asked me the same question. He said, why all the small arms? And I said, I don't know, because we give them lots of small arms, right? The shipment that was interdicted, you know about that shipment, about 18 months ago, had 30,000 rocket-propelled grenades on it. Let's repeat that. In Morse code, that would be 30,000 rocket-propelled grenades. Now, if I was to guess, which is not my job anymore, I'm not an intel guy, I would say I'll bet they're proliferating them to a non-state actor. So, because they don't really need them for the Egyptian army, and they don't fit in with the Egyptian army infrastructure either. You know, they're to NATO standards now. But then the Scuds don't fit into the infrastructure either, and they got a Scud fabrication facility there. So, very curious, very curious. That shipment was worth $23 million, Mark. Just amazing.
So, Bruce,
Keep going, keep going.
before we let you go.
No, we
Although,
got some time.
Yeah, well, we've got 2 minutes, and we'll see if Larry does actually have a question here in a minute. But one of the things that struck me in your presentation, you know, we've all heard about the small arms, we've heard about the missile proliferation and things of that nature. But you mentioned 2 items that kind of caught my attention, and I'm also kind of curious how maybe the North Koreans move them around. But you said that the Iranians buy tanks and subs from the North Koreans.
Yep.
So could you maybe give us a little bit more detail on that, and maybe specifically, you know, how something as large as a tank you smuggle to Iran?
Well, a tank is big. Not as big as our tanks, most of the tanks they have. The tank that their best tank is a T-62 tank. You've probably heard of it, the Chonmo tank, which is a T-62 tank, which, just like everything else North Korea manufactures, they put unique North Korean stuff on it. Some of the stuff is stuff that's actually on a T-80 tank, but the North Koreans put it on a T-62 tank chassis. Why? Because they're North Koreans. Let me give you another example. Who here knows what an SKS rifle is? Okay. It's a standard Soviet-style rifle, right? Used all over the world, Africa, Asia, everywhere. The North Korean version of that is called the Type 73 machine gun. And everybody here knows what a magazine is, right? Not something you see out on the table out front. It's what you put bullets in when you put it into a gun. A standard SKS, the magazine goes in from the bottom. The Type 73 machine gun, the magazine goes in on top, and it looks really goofy. But they have proliferated that. I've seen pictures of Houthis with Type 73 machine guns, Al-Shabaab, Syrian troops, and Iranian troops with the Type 73 machine gun. And it's impossible not to tell it when you see it because the magazine's sticking out of the top. So very interesting stuff. A lot of small arm stuff. The way they get larger stuff over there is they'll often ship it in pieces. It's amazing to me that they're still supplying tanks and tank parts in sub-Saharan Africa, not just the Congo, but Tanzania, Mozambique. And speaking of that, I didn't answer all of Mark's question. The answer is yes. And I'll name some of the countries, and they might surprise you, that where they, instead of paying cash, North Korea will take trade. Syria at times has traded agricultural items, although I don't know what the hell agriculture they got, maybe dates, to the North Koreans for weapons. But most of what they get is paid for by Iran. African countries will trade things, such as diamonds or yellow cake or various things to the North Koreans for cash. And that's very common. Almost every year I read something about some African nation that's trading instead of paying because they just don't have a lot of hard currency. Going all the way back to the 1990s, the Pakistanis were trading highly enriched uranium centrifuges to the North Koreans for Nodong technology. So the barter thing goes on a lot. Does that make sense to you? Give them a couple more. Come on.
All right, well, we are about out of time, but Larry, did you have a question? If you could just wait for the mic since we're live streaming as well.
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Bruce. This book, I think, is very timely right now. And I'll follow up on Don Kirk's question and your comments about Chris Hill. The last two administrations basically have shunned this issue in their diplomacy towards both Iran and North Korea. One of Chris Hill's other mistakes, and it's just not him, it's Condoleezza Rice, George W. Bush, etc., was to let the North Koreans off the hook with regard to the disclosure statement that the North made in June 2008. It was supposed to be a full disclosure of all of their nuclear activities, as specified in the February 2007 six-party agreement. The Bush administration decided not to require in that statement the North Koreans to say anything about their nuclear activities in the Middle East, even the reactor in Syria. And they said nothing in the disclosure agreement. So with regard to much of the information you have about their present activities, both nuclear and missile, with Iran and Syria, do you see any possibility at all that the Trump administration will insist this time that if there is a disclosure statement by North Korea, and the Trump administration reportedly is giving priority to this, that the Trump administration will actually insist that the North Koreans disclose both missile and nuclear activities in the Middle East? Do you see any possibility of that? Do you see any possibility that some elements in Congress may begin to pressure the Trump administration to bring this issue in to any negotiations about a new North Korean disclosure statement?
Well, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
That's a really good question, Larry. And obviously, you know, I'm going to say, well, I hope so. I've spoken to administration officials. Obviously, I'd rather not say who they were when I talked to them in recent months. And there's a lot of concern about what I said. Surprisingly, there was a lot of attention paid to Africa. Africa is not my biggest concern. You know, I'm more concerned about, you know, Houthis shooting long-range Scuds into Saudi Arabia than I am about, you know, a bunch of ragtag guys shooting Type 73 machine guns at each other. But they're both bad, right? There's concern about that. There's concern about the evidence chain because a lot of people aren't writing about this, including in the intelligence community, from what I'm told. That's very concerning to me. I will tell you this. One good sign is the Trump administration did say they're not going to take the pressure off until North Korea actually dismantles its nuclear program. Now, that's a bit ambiguous, right? Because take the pressure off could mean a lot of things. You know, the Obama administration had a bunch of sanctions on North Korea, but they didn't enforce them. Not the way they should have, at least. So there wasn't any real pressure on them. Now they're being enforced. But I think it's important to note, I think you know this, Larry, we see the State Department and especially the Treasury Department come out with these sanctions, right? These individuals, these banks, these front companies. We should be seeing that every week if there's a real pressure campaign going on, right? Because there's hundreds of front companies. Just to give you an example, there are hundreds of North Korean front companies just in Malaysia right now. They're all over the place. This is a target-rich environment. So in my mind, at least unless there's a whole lot going on behind the scenes, one good sign that the pressure campaign is ongoing and it's not just words is that we keep seeing the Treasury Department and the State Department sanctioning these front companies, banks, individuals. I hope that doesn't stop. But if they do stop that, and if they do let North Korea off the hook with some ambiguous statement, And if they don't do the most important thing that you and I know they should do, which is verification, right? If they don't do that, then we're making the same idiotic mistake that Chris Hill and Condoleezza Rice, President Bush made. Because if we don't demand inspections, they're not going to give them, and they're going to keep their stuff.
Pompeo emphasized the verification issue the day before the Singapore summit, when he talked to
Go ahead. You're being
media.
filmed.
But I see no sign that so far in the negotiations, the administration, Pompeo, has really pressed the North for a detailed, systematic verification system inside of North Korea. I see no sign of that so far.
I haven't either. One more.
Well, I have to have someone to have one. And, I mean, we are 7 minutes over our ending.
Well, can I
But
make- can I
anyone
say
who does
one
have
thing?
another question, okay, as you say, can talk to Bruce afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where I'll be signing books.
And selling books.
Yes. So please come.
All right, well, you know, I think as we try to work things out with North Korea, whether we're making mistakes in the past or not, we do need all the information we have, and I think this is an important contribution to have a better understanding of what's going on here. And if we don't understand the full breadth of what's happening, both in terms of how they're earning money, how they're keeping things afloat, it's going to make it more difficult to get where we all want to go, which is a denuclearized, Korean peninsula. So Bruce, thank you for coming. Thank you for sharing this. And if all of you will please join me in thank you. Thank you.